Hello, see this wall? It is a case of a lost Cyclopean work, forgotten atop a hill in central Italy. The fitted stones are everything now left on site, as there are no other buildings nor habitation remains around. Now, what if I tell you all that absence is revealing something hidden? See, in science terms, absence of proof is not proof of absence. However, as we'll see today, the absence of a city inside Cyclopean walls is proving absence of sense in some archaeology. Cyclopean walls, the ancient stone mystery built with odd-shaped stones, cut to fit one to another, are to be found in many places around the world, famously in Peru and in Greece, and also in Italy, that, although less known, is second to none both in quantity and in quality of the Cyclopean works. On the quality aspect, the walls in Italy are impressive, not so much for the nearly impossible stone fitting, but mostly for the way they fit into the breathtaking scenery. Whilst on the quantity front, there are endless kilometers still visible today. Millions of stones fitted in polygonal fashion, spread over 100 locations, mostly concentrated in the central bit of the boot, around Rome. Except in Rome, unexplainably, the Romans established themselves bang in the center of a world-class hub for Cyclopean walls, but had none of these constructions for themselves. A mystery that exposes flaws in the way mainstream archaeology deals with polygonal walls. Vitruvius is known today as the Renaissance Spider-Man, after being drawn by Leonardo da Vinci with 4 legs and 4 arms. But in reality, he was more of a 5-minute craft content creator from the 1st century BC, writing this long book with all sorts of gadgets and construction tips, including stone walls. In his De Architectura, Vitruvius names the three main ways for stone walling in Roman times. One is opus cementum, or the Roman engineers' favorite building technique, applying a brilliant form of concrete to glue stones into strong and practical structures. Then opus quadratum, the second most common type of Roman stone construction, piling squarish decorated blocks perfect for monumental buildings such as palaces or temples. And finally, opus silicium, a name for an inferior work made with irregular stones that Vitruvius clearly states was made by ancient unsophisticated folks, pointing to what we might call today dry stone or random piles of rocks. Although Vitruvius does not elaborate further than that, his words are sadly abused by academics lacking common sense. Some of them take this opus silicium name to signify polygonal or cyclopean walls, oblivion to the fact that irregular and rough stones piled up in the silicium style are as further away as possible from polygonal works, with odd-shaped blocks precisely cut. Meaning, Vitruvius clearly states the stones in opus silicium are piled in their natural format. This is in opposition to polygonal, which has the stones cut into precise shapes. Also lost in translation is Vitruvius saying that Roman engineers did not build in opus silicium, for it being an old and out of fashion technique. with this information disregarded by the same people that had read what wasn't there in the first place. Finally, and even worse, some random bureaucrat recently faked up the name Opus Polygonale, inventing out of nowhere a Neo-Latin expression specifically intended at hiding the fact that Romans not only did not build polygonal walls, they never even talked about them. All this misreading is exposing one failure of archaeology: the dependence on quotes and sound bites, going to the extreme to fake texts just to quote them afterwards. Despite not having polygonal walls in Rome, and that the Romans never cared to write about them, whilst yapping in detail about everything else, the polygonal walls in central Italy are all dated by the academic paper pushers to the 5th century BC, when the Romans were around. This is because of another fail in archaeology that I fancy calling DiCaprio dating. It's like this. If one plastic bottle is found on top of a particular ruin, the building at the bottom is proven to be older than the plastic. Now, how much older? Well, for that anything goes. It could be a decade older, could be a millennium or more. Except for the DiCaprio daters, who always settle for the youngest possible date. For them, the age of consent is not only a minimum but also a maximum, with older than reading also as no older than, resulting in these creepy pairings as with the Italian Cyclopean walls, dated to no older than the 5th century BC. Since for most of the Cyclopean sites in Italy we basically just know the Romans stormed those places in the 4th century BC, that is enough for DiCaprio dating bureaucrats to claim the walls are no older than the 5th century BC, fixating on the youngest possible date. Even ignoring that we do have some indication, although faint, that the walls are much older, with a couple of ancient authors implying that Circeo and Santa Severa were built back in the Bronze Age, thus revealing how this DiCaprio dating fails. While pretending to be strict about something being older but not committing to how much older, in reality it just shows this creepy attraction to no older than younger dates. When we are told there is no good evidence to properly date a Cyclopean wall, and thus the thing needs to be DiCaprio dated, we have to wonder what is the sense of discounting the wall itself, with its thousands of multi-ton boulders carefully fitted to one another, exposing yet another failing in conventional archaeology: the pottery fetish. It's like this. What do humans value more? Is it their houses or the pots and pans in the cupboard? If you said houses, you are implying bureaucrats are not human, because they can look at the wall with thousands of stones fitted in odd shapes and say the only evidence they found on that site was a solitary small piece of pottery. This pottery fetish originates from a misguided attempt to translate the footprint of the Roman Empire into far older cultures. See, the Romans had a nearly industrialized society, trashing millions of pottery shards that can now be systematized into design trends and thus make some good deductions on their age. Whereas older cultures may be less consuming or preferring degradable baskets for storage or whatever, often left us only with one or two and even zero pieces of pottery. Knowing this, if a particular site, let's say a large wall on top of a hill, does not produce significant amounts of broken pots, It is fair to say that by the time the proverbial elephant in a china shop Romans conquered the area, the site was likely already abandoned, revealing yet another fail: the fetish for pottery, a technique that, being quite handy at determining phases of the Roman Empire, simply does not make sense in the absence of an industrialized society fixated with damaging kitchenware. Walls are built from the bottom up. Surprisingly, I know. Thus, what is on the bottom is generally older. However, there is also the case to be made of the layers being all upside down, with the Jenga effect. It's like this. There is a technique in archaeology called stratigraphy that dates sequential events or phases by the layers left from the continuous building and rebuilding on top of older buildings. This is quite okay if we are talking about a city built on a plain or in a valley, but not so much for a Cyclopean wall built on top of a mountain or facing a cliff. In this latter case, we have to consider that the last to enter might be the first to leave, like an elevator. Meaning, whatever was built on top of a mountain and then collapsed downhill tends to get the stratigraphy jumbled up, thus creating the Jenga effect, with sequential buildings collapsing in reversed order. There are dozens of cases in Italy that could serve as an example, with walls located on top of hills, which are said to be as old as the closest Roman town or villa found down in the valley. However, the best illustration for this Jenga fail can be found far away, in Machu Picchu, Peru, when some charcoal samples were dated via carbon-14 testing to the 9th century AD, proving the site is at least 500 years older than the mainstream dating. So, what did the bureaucrats do with this old charcoal? They deleted it from records, calling for trouble stratigraphy, claiming that the samples were not deposited carefully in obedient layers. Now, you might have noticed that Machu Picchu was built on top of a mountain, so it is a good spot for that Jenga effect, jumbling up layers. Even more troubling, the mainstream is also avoiding the reason why a bunch of coal clearly dated 500 years too old for that site was doing in the wrong layer. Going back to the Cyclopean nose city walls in Italy, although we do not have charcoal samples of any age, mostly because no one cared to look for it, we also know these would be quickly deleted from history due to jumbled up stratigraphy or the failing Jenga effect. As sort of a compilation of everything wrong, take this double example: Norba and Monte Carbolino. They are two Cyclopean sites located just 5 kilometers apart from one another, featuring some amazing views over the seacoast. Norba went on to become an important Roman town, with lots of temples and other constructions built on site, leaving us with a nice tourist attraction framed by tremendous views over the cliff. On the other hand, Monte Carbolino is neglected, to the point of being at risk of engulfment by a quarry. In the case of Norba, the Cyclopean walls are dated to the 5th century BC, because that's when the Romans stormed the place and established their rule over the locals. On the other hand, in the case of Monte Carbolino, the walls are also dated to the 5th century BC, because, well, of no reason. Since there is nothing Roman left in Monte Carbolino, let's think about it for a minute. What it is more likely? 1. There was this massive city with kilometers long walls, built when the Romans were around, despite the Romans never writing about it, nor dropping a coin in the market, and not even breaking an amphora on site. Or two. On the other hand, the place was just as much an abandoned ruin when the Romans arrived as it is today. Obviously, the second is the most common sense answer. With the absence of evidence, the lack of a city or even Roman influence being evidence for the wall to be much older, making for the final fail of the day, sort of a mother of all previous defects. It's laziness, grabbing to the closest pre-published idea because that is that. Move along. No one reads academic papers anyway. Confused yet? You'd better be. There is like a conspiracy to confuse us. All these fails, the DiCaprio dating, pottery fetish, whatnot, may have started as good ideas, analyzing semi-industrialized societies that left us a wealth of information, filling academic journals. But, like all things, they can be misused. And in the case of Cyclopean works and the no city walls, the bureaucratic need to write something made them write about nothing, when the facts are quite direct. In central Italy, there are dozens of abandoned Cyclopean walls we know very little of. There are no buildings made with datable wood or organic materials left, no burial grounds of any type on site. The Romans did not care to write about those places, nor to live there and trash the streets with piles of pottery, making the walls not only older than the Romans, but also already abandoned by the time the Romans arrived. Here's the thing. Cyclopean walls remain a mystery because they have nothing to say except that they are there, leaving everything else to speculation. All this absent evidence about who and when and why and even how the walls were made is in fact proving something. In Italy, it is proof that the Romans were absent during the period of the wall's construction. Thus, the walls are likely much older than the mainstream 5th century BC. Furthermore, it is also proof of absence of sense in bureaucrats that chose to ignore the massive walls, just to focus on singular pieces of pottery or some text no one wrote, taking us to conclude that it is as wrong to affirm the walls were from the 5th century BC as it is to say they were built by aliens before the flood with lasers. Moving on, does this mean all Cyclopean walls are misdated and very old? Heck no, there are polygonal walls made just 200 years ago, although even those are interesting and mysterious, as we'll see next, messing up with the Basques. That's it for today. Hope you liked it. See you in the comments.